President of ICOM, Martin Haynes. And let me start first of all by appreciating and thanking you for this very rare privilege that you have given me to be in Milan today and address this impressive audience and just spend a few minutes trying to explore the issues of museums and the African society. I want to start by saying, as I speak, while I'll be trying to show what museums do on our continent and the way we should appreciate them, unfortunately that has been the case, and the reason why my voice focused on our need as a continent to appreciate museums and use them as an important vehicle to move the country forward. As I was doing my research, I was actually mesmerized that museums date back to the 3rd century BC. And what I think was very interesting for me is to appreciate that museums were first introduced and established on the African continent at the University of Alexandria in Egypt. But when you look at the development of museums on the African continent, we are not where the rest of the world is. We lag behind, when in fact, this was the continent that first established museums. And if you listen to the first speaker, actually goes through his own works in trying to renovate even some of the early sculptures and buildings, we are nowhere there on the African continent. However, the good news is that the culture of museums has spread so fast all over the world. And although we were the first on the African continent to establish museums, we will actually learn a lot by interacting with the rest of the world that has moved further. But I think also interesting, and the good news is that regardless of the size of the country on the African continent, there are certain aspects of museums that have been established. In fact, when I served as Minister of Chiefs and Traditional Affairs, I made sure that in getting the ordinary person to appreciate museums, I compelled all the traditional leaders who form the smallest units of governance in our country, where most of our cultural heritage, the objects, the history of our country are found, to establish some kind of museum. And when we designed the houses, the palaces for these traditional leaders, we made sure that in the design, there was some level of a small museum that where a lot of these objects and pictures and sculptures could be kept, so that the ordinary person in those particular chiefdoms were able to start appreciating the importance of museums. Although now the museums are a global concept, I think we are not yet there on our continent, and I think there's need for a very serious and very strong force to start this movement in Africa, so that we can also reach the levels that the rest of the world have reached. And as I was traveling here, I was very happy that because of the movements that we've started in my country, even some of my staff on the African continent now have taken the bull by the horn and want to run on the executive board of museums. And I hope this will receive good attention, because only if we participate at high level shall we create a very important movement on our continent. So Terry Nyambe from Zambia has created the desire to run on the executive board. We all know that the traditional role of a museum is for us to collect the different objects and materials that exist in our countries. These could be religious, they could be of historic importance. So these objects are actually collected, and then using the technique and skill of preservation, they are preserved. And the researchers, especially anthropologists, they do a lot of research so that we try and understand them, because in the past we were not there and we didn't know why certain things were done in a particular way, why certain objects were kept, and what is associated with those things. And I think what is important now is for these to be used by the public, but not only used, but appreciated. And also for us to understand that while we think that currently we are more intelligent than the people that were there, my own view is that people out there then were more intelligent than us. They didn't have the computers. They didn't have the kind of technology that we have. But can you imagine somebody lighting fire from nothing? Whereas now we have a match to light. Can you imagine how people created energy those days, and yet now there's so much technology that help us create energy? And I think that these are important tools for the education of not only the public, but the future, and the future are our children. And in many instances, they are for enjoyment, entertainment, and so on. What is sad for us on the continent is that museums are associated with elitists. They are associated with the educated, and they don't inspire many people. And therefore, a lot of people stay aloof and they don't visit museums. I took an interest to look at the statistics of how many Zambians actually visit museums. And you find that people that fly into Zambia are the major visitors to our museums. And the indigenous Zambians take very little interest in museums. They've kept aloof. And if you then stratify for education, you find that mainly it's the educated people that visit our museums. And most of these are those that are carrying out research. And because they've been compelled by research to visit the museums, then they visit the museums. And once they write whatever research they are writing, that is the end. And the general public have always been excluded from visiting our museums. Now, when you actually look at museums and the perception of our people, the people feel that museums are houses that have been created by man and are part of our modern society. And I always argue that we need to look at them as institutions which are the ones that house our history, our nature, and they are really the cultural soul of every nation, because they remind us of who we were, where we are coming from, and where we are going. And in fact, museums are really the ones that hold the cultural wealth and the nation in trust. Because some of the things that we find in the museums in our countries are really so important. Let me take this opportunity to share with all of you that Zambia as a country has been associated with the evolution of man. In fact, one of our very important objects that was found during the colonial days of Zambia, known as the Broken Hill Man, which is a skull of a human being, which talks a lot to the evolution of man, was first found in Zambia. And today, Zambia doesn't have this object. What we have is a dummy of this object, because the British took this Broken Hill Man. Today, it's not the Zambians that enjoy seeing the Broken Hill Man, but the British. All efforts by Zambia to get back our Broken Hill Man has fallen on deaf ears. This is how important some of these objects are. And can you imagine what this will do to Zambia? if our broken human was in our museums in Zambia? How many people would fly to Zambia to come and look at this object? How much our children would be educated on what this broken human looked like when it was first discovered. We also have a part of Zambia, and today we are joined by a team from Moto Museum, where we have one of the deepest falls in the world, the Kalambo Falls. And the Kalambo Falls has been associated, again, with the evolution of man. And when Zambia starts doing its excavations, these are some of the objects that we're going to have in our museums in Zambia. And I believe that museums are actually the cultural conscience of every nation. And the reason why museums have not taken a center stage in our country is because of their historic beginnings in many of the developing countries. And at the time of our colonialism in our country, museums had this tag that this is where unwanted objects are kept and the materials that are not wanted are deposited. Because in Africa, as all of you may know, that we have this phenomenon of witchcraft. And in some of our museums, we have sections of our museums where the objects of witchcraft are kept. So this was the song that was sung, that the museums is where you find these kind of objects. And therefore, a lot of people had very negative tendencies because they were associated, these museums were associated with witchcraft, they were associated with idolatry and fetish religions that they were kept there, especially in countries where they had these fetish religions. So again, this tag has made it difficult for our people to start appreciating the role museums can play in national development. And it's sad that, in fact, what has come out of museums in our countries is this negativity. And because of this negativity, it has continued to inhibit development of museums in our countries. And this can be said for a lot of developing countries. And again, I would like to take advantage of my standing here and speaking that really we need a very, very strong movement in Africa to actually move the museum from this negative tag to a positive tag. And I was particularly pleased when Dr. Martin Haynes came to Zambia, because for the week that he was in Zambia, even the perception of museums in our country changed, because on a daily basis, people listen to the positive statements that we associated with the museums, and a positive tag has since developed in our country. But we need to do this a little bit more, and this is the challenge the ICOM has. And in fact, if we are to move forward, you cannot move museums on one part of the world and leave anybody behind. And I think all of us are aware that the new 17 SDGs say nobody shall be left behind, and I hope museums in Africa will not be left behind. And in this modern society, it has become urgent that we start appreciating the role of museums in every country. And also to actually move a movement of preservation of a lot of our objects. What I've seen in Africa is a lot of our very important objects have left Africa and they have found their way in other countries. And yet one of the beliefs of ICOM is that objects that have been taken out of Africa and taken to other countries must find their way back to our countries, because it is important that our children learn about these things. But when you visit a lot of museums out there in Europe, you find a lot of African objects there. And I think it is important that you redefine this and help us to get back our objects. And it's important as we speak we have these big conferences like we have here in Milan. One of these days, a big conference like this is held in some country in Africa, because this will help us redefine the missions and goals of museums, their functions, and the strategies that will help reflect the expectations of our people. Because the only way people will start appreciating institutions like this, if they get to participate, they get to hear. And you can imagine if this conference was taking place in Zambia, how many Zambians would be sitting and standing before me, and how much they would appreciate the role of museums. It's important for us to start appreciating and that museums are actually agents of change, and they are part of the development of any nation, because they mirror the events in society and they become instruments of progress by calling attention to action. Because once people start hearing the kind of language that is being spoken about here, even what I heard by the previous presenter would be inviting people like those to come back home and come and build on some of our historic heritages that we have in Zambia, so that we don't lose them. Because you find some of the most beautiful landscapes in our country, some of the most beautiful buildings, which are now being brought down because nobody appreciates the need to preserve them. If we continue with this appreciation and movement of museums, the events that will be taking place in our countries will encourage development in our society. And this institution will be important in fostering peace and promoting the ideals of the communities and the nation at large. Today, museums are important because they will retain their relevance and become positive partners in the development agenda of our country. Even when you talk about tourism, can you imagine how many tourists will be coming to our countries? Because in fact, we have more to offer in our countries. But who knows about them? Nobody knows about them, because we are not active participants of what is happening in the rest of the world. Because we would take time when you have exhibitions to bring some of the exhibits that we have in our countries that would attract a lot of people in Europe, in the Americas, to come to some of our countries, to come and experience some of our national heritage. And I believe as a person that museums are unique. And if we could use the unique resources that are found in the museums, the potential that museums have, they can be very important in changing the dynamics of our society. And there could be quite a lot of urban change in our countries. I also believe that museums possess critical resources in a lot of our societies. And if people are exposed to this critical resource that they possess, this can actually promote and foster the best of our culture and historic ideals of our nations. At the moment, a lot of people associate Africa with all the negatives. In fact, when people travel to our countries, and I'm sure you've seen this, all you hear about Africa is the poverty in Africa. Even the pictures that are taken, no positive pictures are taken of Africa. Every time I've traveled and I'm watching television, all I see are these dirty children and with mucus on their nose and combed hair, that this is Africa. There's so much suffering in Africa, give to Africa. No, we don't want that. We want positive pictures taken of Africa, our natural heritage, our cultural landscape, and say, look at Africa, go travel to Africa and visit Africa. We don't want handouts. We want to earn our money through the important cultural landscapes, the objects that we have in our museums, so that when people fly into our countries, they are exposed to these kind of things. Maybe those pictures that you see are rare pictures that you see. I think the better side of Africa are the things that we have, some of which have found their way in your own museums. And as I said, museums should be the ones that actually bring a very positive landscape to our countries. And I think that if we promoted museums to the level that this has happened in the developed countries, they can give a voice of the citizens of our countries, and they can create avenues for a free discussion so that when we are here, we can also participate freely and exchange views and ideas and what we have to show in our countries. And a lot of you will be attracted to come to Africa, and you will not be thinking about this dark continent, a continent that has nothing to offer, a continent full of poor people. No, Africa is an exciting place to be, and invite you all to come. And I hope over the next few days, the staff that are here from Zambia will participate in free dialogue, free discussion, and sell the ideals and objects that we have on our continent. And museums can be an important avenue of you knowing what the real past of Africa is and where Africa is headed to. Can you imagine how ordinary people built those pyramids in Egypt? Can you imagine how the Zambians decorated the caves in Akuvu Cave? There must have been something about them that is worthy reading about, worthy knowing about. How do you feel when you go to Egypt and see these caves? How do you feel when you come to Zambia and see the stone writing that is found on our stones? All these are there, and they are important attractions for everybody to see. And because of this, those that have known about what Zambia was about what Kenya is about what Egypt is about, they come to Zambia to research. And they visit our museums and research about the different things that we have, which have been written in some of the books. And we also find that a lot of these people are tourists who, when they land in Zambia and they learn about the museum, they don't want to leave the museum. Let me just share with you that last year, we had the prince and princess from Japan visit Zambia. And they were given 10 minutes to visit our Livingstone Museum. And I happened to have been the Minister of Honor. The prince and princess didn't want to leave our museum. He even had to demand for a notebook to start writing every step of what he saw in the museum. Can you imagine if any of you came to Zambia, how much you would learn? This was a prince and princess from Japan. And instead of the 10 minutes he was allocated, we spent 2 hours in the Livingstone Museum. And he said to me, you know, these are things we don't know about because nobody talks about them. I have learned over time, especially when I became Minister of Chiefs and Traditional Affairs, that museums are an important place to be educated. Any moment you spend in the museum is educative. They actually have this capacity and ability, just by the display that you find there, to actually impact on you in terms of education. They have the tools and materials that are unique. They are unique collections. You have not seen them before, and they add to your body of knowledge. And I think children would benefit a lot from being exposed to museum. And in my own country, we have insisted that we have educational tours to museums because the children actually come out there better than they went in. And the public itself needs to be moved to be able to take interest in the history of our country. And they are actually going to assist our future generation. Even as you leave your country to go and interact with our people, we have more appreciation, those of us who have interacted with the museums, and in terms of the history of our country, the cultures of our country, and the achievements that were done by our people in the past. I have appreciated the materials that I find in the museums, and it is important in enriching and improving our school curriculum. In fact, I keep saying to my colleagues who are running the ministries of education that when I'll have an opportunity to actually be a minister of education, I would like museums to be part of the curriculum. And working closely with the educational planners, I always say, can you interact with the museum experts? Because the resources that are found there are very important. You cannot teach history without showing them what you're teaching. And there should always be this interaction between the experts and the processes of learning at all levels. The types of museums that we find in Zambia are those that have our natural history, especially the Moto Moto Museum. You learn a lot about the history of Zambia. We have those that display our environment, what it looked like before and what it looks like now. We have science and part of our issues of industry. We have some parts of our museums where you learn a lot about our cultural heritage. And recently, we established a mining museum in Kabwe, where even the Broken Hill mine was collected from. It was during a mining activities that the Broken Hill mine was found. And if there are people from Britain in this audience, I would like to appeal to you once again that bring back our Broken Hill mine. Now there are a number of people in Zambia that are trying to establish a peace museum. You may all know and appreciate that Zambia is the icon of peace in Africa. This is one country which is known and celebrated for the peace that we have promoted, not only for our country, but we participated in ensuring that all our neighboring countries in the southern part of Africa are liberated and peaceful at the moment. So we are trying to build a peace museum because of that history. And recently, the president that was the icon of peace, the first Republican president, Dr. Kenneth Kaunda, was actually awarded a peace award. We still don't have an art museum, but I hope that is something Zambia can work towards. In conclusion, in this day and age, we can no longer continue to ignore the role of museums that they can play and should play in our country. I believe that museums are leaders in the promotion of the heritage of any nation. And in a changing world, museums have become very important institutions and respected. And this is the way we would like to move Zambia and see that museums become an important component of our governance and democracy in our country. And I hope that in the near future, somebody will think about putting together a democracy museum, because Zambia was the first African country to ever introduce democracy in Africa. And our second Republican president, Dr. Chiluba, may his soul rest in peace, was the architect of this democracy. I think with these very few words, I would like to say thank you very much once again for giving me this opportunity to come here and share our thoughts on museums. And most importantly, I hope Zambia will be considered on the executive board so that we can continue interacting with all of you. And maybe we can be the leader to lead the movement in Africa for appreciating the role that museums play and will continue to play in the development of our nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your great speech here to the audience of ICOM. And I think we still have a little time for questions and answers. And please raise your hands. Who would like to start with a question? I see one in the back. And please identify yourself before you start with the question. Thank you.
I'm Margarita Ozola from Latvia, from Tukums Museum. And I'm representing also international organization Bridging Ages, which is dealing with applied heritage and heritage education, as well as time traveling method. So, and I have a bit of experience in working in African countries too. So I would like at first to thank you for that keynote speech and explaining or your views and your ideas. The role of the museums in Africa really is very important, it's crucial. So, but I wanted to ask you, you have pointed out several times how important is our museums for development of tourism. So my question is, what do you plan, or how do you look to the community museums or eco museums, so small museums in villages? Because I suppose in Africa it's really very important to use museum as a tool for the development of small local rural places. Thank you.
I did say in my presentation that today, one of the policy that government has put in place is that every chiefdom, and we have 289 chiefs, which is the smallest unit of governance in our country. These are the traditional leaders, have been compelled to have a small museum in that particular chiefdom. And the objects that are collected within those chiefdoms are kept in that museum. And even the design of the palaces, we have insisted that as part of the palace, there is a small museum. But also we have identified all the national heritage sites within the chiefdom, so that when visitors are visiting that particular chiefdom, including the owners of the community there, they should find time to visit some of these things and learn. That's why I'm saying the Minister of Education, as a way forward, should make this as part of the curriculum for the children to learn, even in class, about these particular places. That's one. And in terms of ethnic museum, in fact, one of the participants here is the director of the Moto Museum. What we have done with the Moto Museum, first of all, is to have a place within the Moto Museum where we even have all the traditional games as part of the museum, so that those children who have never seen what these games are like, we have, for example, games we used in the olden days, they are called in solo. They help the children learn how to count. We have created a place for the children to go there and experience this. Furthermore, we have put immediately a linkage with the nearest village, so that when people visit the Moto Museum, they can actually now go to the village to see the lifestyle of the village as part of the ethno museum. So this is what we're doing, and we are actually carrying out a revolution at community level for them to start appreciating the role that museum, but also to learn from what is found in our museum and also in the environment of those particular communities.
Thank you. Thank you. May I ask a question?
Where are you?
Here.
What is
here?
Here.
Here. My name is Itala Vidan, and I am from the University of Milano. I've been working and doing research work in Africa for long years, many years, And I listened with great pleasure and attention to your enlightened keynote speech. But I wanted to say a few things. First of all, that you are quite right that the colonial stereotype is still, alive, alas, working especially in Europe, in former colonial countries. But unfortunately, this vision of Africa as a poor and underdeveloped, area has been reinforced recently by this wave of migrations, which created a reaction all over Europe, and they are still doing so. I'm speaking from Italy, where, many boats loaded with migrants land every day and night, and have been doing so for quite a few years now. But going to our subject, the museum, what I would like to see more in Africa, I think, is a museum geared on the community, geared on the local cultures, on the needs of the local culture, rather than on models coming from elsewhere. Because only by doing this, you might have, real participation, from the people. They might be small museum, as the person who spoke before me was saying, or big museums, this doesn't matter, but different, more attentive to the needs and the requirements of the community, because in Africa, the community feeling is very strong. Everything must be within the community. The community must participate. If there isn't this, the museum won't work. And many old museums built on the basis of colonial museums cannot really work in a situation, in an African situation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think if you had a moment to visit Zambia, you find that apart from the Livingstone Museum and the Lusaka Museum, which were built on the colonial thinking, we in Zambia have really promoted a lot of community museums. If you go to Choma is a very community museum. Moto Museum is very community oriented. And recently, amongst the new museum that we are developing in Mambwe, for example, even the community participated in the design. Within this museum, we've even got a marketplace. Because, as you know, in Africa, we believe in community interaction. And one of the ways to interact is a market. So we've actually put a marketplace within this museum. So I think there is a lot of thinking now of making museums as relevant as possible to our lives. And I think there are very few people now that are poisoned with colonial thinking in a lot of our countries, because we've seen that it doesn't help us one bit. I think it is very important to be as real and as cultural, and also to try and appreciate our own. You cannot start importing outside thinking. You have to have your own natural thinking. But for the sake of being relevant to the international world, because the world is a global movement, we actually create space for also the international participation. Because if we just become a community and forget about what is happening outside our world, our own countries, then you are stifling people from knowing what's happening elsewhere. So you have a mixed type of museums now, where you have relevance to the country, education, development, as well as connecting with others, because you have to connect with others too. So that's the way, at least in Zambia, that's the way our museums are developing. And then we put in the current happenings. For example, there was something in Zambia that when you hear of rapists, like when I was a student in London, there was this Jack the Ripper. In Zambia, we had what we called the Milan brothers. And they really terrorized people. And it is believed that they had some kind of medicine of some kind where when you tried to look for them, the police, they wouldn't find them. They could be standing there and you wouldn't see them. And I think it is important for us to tell this story. So in one of our museums, we have actually got the Milan brothers. Finally, they were gunned down. And we found some very interesting things. They had pictures of the would-be imagined wives, and all of them were white. And it was interesting. What is it that was going on into their heads? That each one of them in their cave, they actually lived in the caves. They had the so-called wife, but this wife was a white woman, long hair, blonde, and those kind of things. So we have a section in our main museum in Lusaka of the life of the Milan brothers, so that the children can come and learn about them. So we're looking at history, current, and all sorts of things, but also focusing on our community issues, which people are going to resonate with, and they will be able to identify with those things. Thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues are moving out already to reach their next working groups, but we still have one or two questions. Maybe we can collect the questions and the minister will answer. No, you can start, but Amar, you and then Amar, and then the answer at the end.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. My question is to the minister. As a minister, you know that the change of museums rely on training of staff. Without training, no change, even if you have all the help of the rest of the world. If we look at training, UNESCO created in 1975 the Center of Jos. The Center of Jos died because no African country support the center. UNESCO created in 1985 the center in Niamey. The regional center of Niamey died because there was no support. I can go on like this for l'École du Patrimoine Africain, for what has been created in Kenya. No support, so all those places died. We had a chairperson who was Omar Konare, who was African. He tried to launch AFRICOM. It's half died because there's no politician, no political support. Why does the country doesn't support the creation which has been done, and all institutions which have been created in Africa for training have died? This is my question. Thank you.
Maybe the next one. Amar, will you follow?
Yeah. Sorry, it's me next.
My name is Grace from Kenya. Mine is more of a comment and a support of one of your keynote speeches. You talked about the artifacts of Africa being held in the Western countries, and I'm posing a challenge to ICOM to perhaps help Africa get back all its artifacts that are being held in the Western countries. And I'm also challenging ICOM to help Africa promote its museums. I think there's something that they can come up with to help in terms of improving their image, because most of the images that are portrayed about Africa is how people are dying of hunger and all these negative things. But if you look at the positives and the culture, there's so much that Africa has to offer. I wish ICOM can take up that challenge and help Africa in terms of promoting this. Thank you.
Just one remark. After the, I was told that after the International Museum Day events in Zambia, the government of Zambia decided to pay for the ICOM Zambia membership. So that means the numbers of the National Committee is increasing, and that gives them the opportunity to come in contact to all our international colleagues, like here in Milan, but also during the years when the international committees meet somewhere. So I'm very thankful and grateful for this offer, and maybe it could be a model for other countries as well. And I think this is not the time to speak about ICOM's activities for Africa. We do a lot right now, but we are running out of time here, and we can talk about that a bit later, because we have to close that session very soon. Amar is the last speaker.
Thank you, Mr. President. Also, thank you for your last comment, but because the countries themselves have to empower themselves to lead their participation in ICOM. Madam Nkandu, thank you for being so honest and hitting the nail on the head, so to say. In 1999, October, Gail has mentioned from ICRAM, the range of initiatives and asking why they failed. But in 1999, October, your country generously hosted the Constituent Assembly of AFRICOM. It was launched in Lusaka. I happened to be the chair of the program committee at that stage, living in South Africa at that stage. It brought back something we really need to think, because I think the president of ICOM has put it in a very indirect way, the same thing. A former president of ICOM, Alpha Konare, who was also president of Mali, president of the African Union, organized an ICOM conference years ago called What Museums Africa? And then he started in 1999, right? 1999. 1991, and then he started off at the Kill the Museum. It translated poorly for French. What he meant was kill the colonial museum, decolonize the African museum. My own experience of working in Africa, and more recently in Ethiopia, has been that there's still this imagined idea. Museums, like you said, are relevant, but they need to be contextualized. And what I want to ask you is, with the membership going up, Chomo Museum you mentioned, Moto you mentioned, one of our ICOM members, Manuel Mukela, was quite a leader in this. And how can one country, I think that we should stop stereotyping Africa, one whole continent. When it comes to Europe or other countries, South America, we talk about all the countries. But how can Zambia, how do you see Zambia taking a unique leadership, given you have Chomo, you have Moto, and a number of other really wonderful museums? Your own First President's House Museum, is an amazing museum, just like Mandela's Orlando Museum, So can you comment on 3 things you could do to say not just Africa, but Zambia, how Zambia can take leadership like it did in 1999 with ICOM in launching AFRICOM? Thank you.
Well, I will just combine the 2 questions in one. I think for Zambia, what actually has done it is the fact that in 2011, the president then, may his soul rest in peace, introduced this Ministry for Chiefs and Traditional Affairs, which is very unique in its nature and in driving development in the country. And I don't think there's any country in Africa that has this ministry, because this ministry drives home the importance of people themselves being in the driving seat in terms of development. And in the past, I don't think anybody ever appreciated museums as much as we're appreciating them now as a government. And probably the reason why we did not participate in all these educational activities, because there wasn't even a budget which was specifically looking at museums, looking at issues of cultural heritage. They just survived. It was a name. But now, because they fall under a specific ministry, in most countries they fall under tourism. So tourism is a tool to market what you have, but it's not one that actually builds a momentum. So I think that's what has helped Zambia to be where it is today. And the reason why, especially with the visit of Martin Hayes to Zambia, and this whole week of just talking about museum, it created this momentum. So what I think that needs to happen in Zambia, and maybe ICOM can learn from this, and I want to use my own profession to probably give you some ideas, is that in the area where I work in health, you find that a lot of people who set up institutions and organizations like ICOM, they have what they call their goodwill ambassadors, who then go and get everybody to start appreciating a particular agenda. One of the areas in which I worked for many, many years is in the HIV arena. And most African countries were going through what you call denial, that they didn't have HIV and that this HIV was imported. But what the African Goodwill Ambassador did was to go and move a momentum in all African countries to see that this is an important disease. It requires all of us to wake up and make sure that this happens. And, everybody now in Africa realized that HIV was there, it was killing people, nobody had imported it, and it was a disease found in our countries. I also belong to another thing called the EDCTP. They have what they call their high-level representative. What the high-level representative has done is to make sure that they go and galvanize support at the AU and everywhere, and now countries are paying their contribution to EDCTP, both in terms of kind and cash. But what also that does, it has taken this agenda to the AU, and the AU has taken it on as an important thing. So this is something that we can do at the African level and make sure that countries start appreciating museums as an important educational tool, an important tourism tool. At the moment, even them, their minds are all colonized with the colonial thinking. And they think, oh, museum just come from somebody's imposing museums on Africa. But we need to start looking at it as our institution. And like somebody said in that corner, you even start building the community museums, which is something that we are doing in Zambia. So Zambia can provide that leadership to galvanize other countries to start looking at museums in a positive manner and stop looking at them. When there's a lot of negativity, what that does, it makes people also become negative, and they start looking at things with negativity. And what we need in Africa is to build what I call positive energies around museums. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. And this is the end of our session. I thank all of you for coming.